Milan Kundera believed that the struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. But what he actually shows in the Book of Laughter and Forgetting is far more disturbing, that we don't need dictators to erase our past. We happily do it to ourselves. And from there, Kundera's most disturbing insights about human nature start to unfold. I wanted to use these insights to discuss how language, shame, and our desperate need for meaning shape not only history at large, but also our own private lives and inner psyche. Kundera was an influential Czech-French novelist best known for his philosophical and often politically charged works. His work, The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, is not a novel in the classical sense. So before we jump into it, we need to understand its structure. Kundera describes it as a set of variations on a few recurring themes like memory, forgetting, shame, power, and the absurdity of being. Much like musical variations in Bach by which Kundera was influenced, each section feels like a different composition on the same melody. Political erasure, personal shame, linguistic manipulation, and the ways we hurt others in the name of care. Together they form a loosely connected yet decidedly coherent portrait of what it means to live in a world where everything from history to personal truth can be rewritten. The book moves between political, fictional, and autobiographical themes so seamlessly that it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. One moment you are in communist Czechoslovakia witnessing political erasure. The next you are on a surreal island with unclothed children doing questionable things to some women. To say that it is disturbing and at times purely grotesque might be an understatement. At times it feels deliberately banal and filled with the most petty, ordinary, and painfully flawed characters imaginable. But in a way it feels intentional and serves a role to interrogate the darker sides of both the human psyche and the power dynamics that shape our lives. Language, our escape hatch from the past. The book begins by laying a famous historical scene in Prague. It's a cold day in February in 1948. The new communist leader, Klement Gottwald, stands on a balcony addressing the cheering crowd below who is celebrating the successful communist takeover. Beside him stands his loyal comrade, Vladimir Klementis. Gottwald isn't wearing a hat, and the cold is biting and snow is starting to fall. So in a small protective gesture, Klementis removes his own fur hat and places it on his leader's head. The cameras flash and capture this victorious moment. The snow, the cheering masses, the two men on the balcony. Except that 4 years later, that same Klementis is accused of treason. He's arrested, executed, and erased. Quite literally. The famous photograph of Gottwald on the balcony remains, but the man who gave him his hat has been airbrushed out of the photo. Only the hat remains. It's a moment so absurd it almost sounds comical, a man reduced to a hat. Yet this absurdity is exactly the logic of power. The image must at all costs remain clean and untarnished, perfectly consistent with the narrative the totalitarian regime decided is the correct one. Kundera uses this scene to show how power establishes its grip by rewriting the past. The regime's language begins to overwrite what actually happened and replace what people remember with what they are told to remember. And slowly, the linguistic version becomes the only version. It is told enough times until the new version feels more real than what actually happened. Change how people talk about the past, and you change what they remember about it. But it is not only totalitarian regimes that recognize that to control language is to control memory. We all carry that recognition, albeit on a more subconscious and intuitive level. And Kundera uses a little fictional story to illustrate this desire within us to change our past by deliberately choosing the words to narrate it. We meet Marek, an intellectual who lives under post-Prague Spring Czechoslovakia. It's 1971, when state censorship and surveillance had intensified again. This meant that keeping any sort of records or documentation, even if personal correspondences, was enough to attract the state's suspicion and potential prosecution. But for Kundera's characters, even keeping a diary or personal letters is a political act. And our Merrick is no exception. He had kept his diaries and personal correspondences not only as a form of rebellion, but also as a reminder of the self he refuses to let the regime rewrite. Because to forget who you are is to let others redefine you and tell you who you are. But as much as he wanted to hold on to the truth of his identity, his relationship to truth was highly selective, as it is the case with all humans. Because there was one part of his past he was not particularly fond of, and that is a relationship he had 25 years ago with a woman he now decided was ugly and politically shallow. Yes, politically shallow. That's what he tells himself. That's why he needed to remove that part of the past. So he sets out to drive to her home to retrieve the love letters he had written her back in the day and destroy them. As he was driving, he recalled how shallow she was to cry over the death of some irrelevant politician. But here he pauses to reflect. Did that really happen? Or was that narrative driven by his current feelings about her? Well, the truth is, it's not her shallowness that makes him want to erase her existence from his past. It's rather shame. He's deeply ashamed of having loved such an ugly woman at an earlier time of his life when his insecurity about himself had led him to believe that he had no other options. And now that life has proven him that he is capable of attracting women better than her, he's ashamed of that black mark on his past. Here Kundera inserts himself to clarify that she did actually cry over the death of some politician. But it was not motivated by political affinities as Merrick was tempting himself now to believe. It was rather her twisted, naive way of proving her loyalty to Merrick. At that time, that intensified his feelings for her. Note that the fact of her crying doesn't change, neither does the fact that he once loved her. But the narrative associated with these facts had changed. Once her tears had meant devotion. Now they simply mean stupidity. Once his love was real. Now it's evidence of his past weakness. So while he defends memory as sacred against political power, he simultaneously wants to erase personal memory that embarrasses him. And here lies Kundera's point, that language is the most instrumental element of forgetting. We don't need to destroy memories to erase them. We only need to tell them differently, until the new version feels real enough to live with. It is something we are all guilty of doing to varying degrees. We obsess over the past far more than we do over the future because it's the only thing that feels both real and unbearable. The future is only an indifferent void no one cares about, but the past is filled with life, and its continence is irritating, repellent, wounding, to the point that we want to destroy or repaint it. We want to be masters of the future only for the power to change the past. We fight for access to the labs where we can retouch photos and rewrite biographies and history. Kundera makes the point that the future itself is empty and abstract, but the past, it's personal and full of life. And we look forward to the future only because it gives us the permission to rewrite what came before. Our hunger for the future and the hope it brings with it is merely a hunger to correct the narrative and for the power to decide what was true all along, with words carefully chosen to suit the image of the person we decided we want to be now. What's interesting is that we like to think that memory is something that just happens to us passively, but most of the time it's an active act of shaping and reshaping. We don't even need governments to censor our past when we do it ourselves with more graceful words. Like Merrick, our relationship to truth is highly selective. Litost, the cruelty of humiliation. The Czech language has a word called Litost that Kundera concludes has no equivalent in any other language and is best explained using a little story. A young student goes swimming with his girlfriend. He's a terrible swimmer, with his head poking out of the water in a ridiculous pose, while she, on the other hand, is an excellent, graceful swimmer. Out of her fondness for him, she slows down and pretends to match his pace. When the swim is over, she decides to take one final lap at her natural pace to enjoy her favorite sport. Watching her swim swiftly away, the student is suddenly overwhelmed by a crushing sense of humiliation and the realization of his own inadequacy. He feels Litost, and he slaps her on the face. She bursts into tears, and his sense of calmness is restored. He tells her that he was worried about her when she went swimming in the deeper area of the sea he had previously warned her about. Love absolute is actually a desire for absolute identity. The woman we love ought to swim as slowly as we do. She ought to have no past of her own to look back on happily. But when the illusion of absolute identity vanishes, the girl looks back happily on her past or swims faster, love becomes a permanent source of the great torment we call Litost. When we love someone, we subconsciously expect sameness from them, that they like the same things we do, have the same depth as we do, appreciate the same things, have the same pace, share the same pain, and so on. But the moment we see that they are different, that they swim faster or look back happily on a past without us, that love becomes a source of Litost. Litost could be explained as a deep sense of torment and sudden awareness of one's own misery and shortcomings. But that's not where the story ends. Kundera explains that it's accompanied by a deep desire for revenge against the person who exposed our inadequacy, even if only in the form of making them feel bad or guilty. The goal of revenge is to make one's partner look as miserable as oneself. The man cannot swim, but the woman slapped cries. It makes them feel equal and keeps their love going. Though for Kundera, that revenge takes one of two forms, depending on the person who induced Litost in us. If we perceive the person to be weaker, we hurt them directly, like the student slapping his girlfriend. But if we perceive the other person to be stronger, then we hurt them by means of an indirect blow, like causing them to hurt themselves. As an example, he tells a story of a child who is very bad at playing the violin. His teacher harshly corrects him and urges him to play better. The child feels Litost and wants to cry, but instead of trying to play better, he deliberately plays worse and worse. The teacher goes mad and throws him out the window, and as he falls, he's delighted at the thought that the teacher will be charged with murder. A little exaggerated, but I guess you get the point. Any act that will drive the other person into misery indirectly. But actually, the revenge associated with Litost isn't even the darkest thing about it. What's even worse is that it is cloaked in pathetic hypocrisy, that it is presented as a sense of concern and care for the other person and their best interest. As esteemed citizens of the world, we don't tend to call things by their name. We must preserve the narrative associated with a perfect image at all costs. Like the student telling his girlfriend that he was agitated merely because he was so worried she would drown. How could she worry him like that? But what happens if we are unable to deliver revenge? Say someone wronged you by exposing your weakness to you, but before you could realize it, they are gone and you can't reach them anymore. Theoreticians are familiar with this kind of situation and call it Litost block. It is the worst that can happen. The student Litost was like a tumor, growing by the minute, and he did not know what to do about it. When one feels unbearably humiliated but can do nothing about it, their Litost has nowhere to go, so it becomes a tumor growing by the minute. That suffering festers into obsession and turns inward and grows further and further instead of being released or acted upon. One feels a sense of great restlessness and itching to do something or hurt the other person in any way possible, even if just to wish upon a star that they suffer the worst thing imaginable. I suppose this links back to the theme of the book about forgetting. The experiences for which we have no language to describe fade faster from memory. Upon reflecting, you could probably count certain situations where you had no chance to externalize or act upon this kind of growing rage inside you when someone hurts you, even if simply by telling them, hey, that hurt me. But since such experiences never had a clear label like Litost, they are vague and formless in one's head and lost over time. Graphomania. The obsession with self-expression. I was thinking to myself recently how it seems like everybody nowadays is writing a book, even people who don't seem to have much to say. And the strangest thing is that if you look closely at their self-published books, they sound strangely like ChatGPT. Kundera diagnoses a condition of our modern society where everybody is eager to write and to be read. This uncontrollable proliferation of non-professional writing is what he links to graphomania, the obsession with writing for a public of unknown readers, as opposed to writing letters to family and friends, for example. Kundera believes that it becomes epidemic in its proportions when three conditions are met: an elevated level of general well being, which allows people to devote themselves to useless activities, a high degree of social atomization, and as a consequence, a general isolation of individuals, the absence of dramatic social changes in the nation's internal life. From this point of view, it seems to me symptomatic that in France, where practically nothing happens, the percentage of writers is 21 times higher than in Israel. To illustrate this, he introduces us to another comically insignificant character of his, Bibi. Bibi isn't a poet or a thinker or even a particularly memorable person in any way. She is just one of those minor presences who would never have been noticed at all, if not for the strange urgency with which she decides she must write. Bibi feels that she has something inside her that must be expressed, though she can't quite say what it is. She admits that from the outside, she hasn't experienced anything in her life to write about, but she must write about herself, because that would be profoundly interesting. The mainspring that drives her to write is just that absence of vital content, that void. I suppose that underneath it is partly this undying human hunger for immortality through word. Once one's basic needs are satisfied and one no longer has to fight to sustain themselves, one starts to look for other ways to survive beyond death. For example, by means of a work of their own, like a book. But perhaps the other part of it is the desire to feel a recognition that we exist and that our life matters. Goethe once wrote something to the effect of, "Is one alive when other men are living?" In a world where there are billions of people, what does any one life mean, really? I once saw a clip on my feed, I suppose from a movie. Unfortunately, I don't know which movie, but it said something like, "People get married because we want someone to witness our life. If no one bears witness to our existence, we feel we might as well have not lived at all. So we express ourselves through word obsessively." While it might be driven by self-preservation and expression, when everyone writes to assert their presence, Kundera fears that it only worsens the condition. The more one is isolated and writes to feel connected, the more they isolate themselves intentionally to be able to write. And soon they will be surrounded by walls of their own words so thick that no one else's word could get through. I suppose this is a warning as much as it is a diagnosis. If our need to express our world becomes so obsessive that it isolates us, it denies the original purpose for which it originated, to connect us. I can certainly see how this applies to my own life when I'm bent over a script writing for hours and days, meanwhile marginalizing the other aspects of my life that made it rich in the first place. Children, you are the future. One recurring theme in Kundera's book seems to be his immense dissatisfaction with what humanity has become, how depth and meaning are lost under totalitarian regimes as much as by the individuals bending to them and submitting to conformity out of comfort and fear of standing out. He talks about the communist president of Czechoslovakia, Husak, during the 1970s, who oversaw the period of normalization after the Prague Spring. He chooses to call him the president of forgetting. While the president of forgetting allowed the mass immigration of the scientists and the writers and the poets of the country, that is exactly the kind of people power wants to get rid of, since their presence means the persistence of collective memory and history, he panicked when a particular pop singer left the country. So he wrote him a letter saying, "Come back, we will help you and you will help us." Kundera gives this singer another of his endearing names, the idiot of music. Pop music with its shallowness is exactly what power needs to erase history and memory. Music without memory is what Kundera calls it, alluding to how Bach would cringe in his grave if he were to hear it. There exists a primeval state of music, a state prior to its history, a state before the first questioning, before the first reflections, before the first games with motive and theme. That primeval state of music, music without thought, mirrors the human being's inherent stupidity. It required an immense effort of heart and mind for music to rise above that essential stupidity. And it is that splendid arc over centuries of European history which has been extinguished like a skyrocket at the peak of its trajectory. Music not born out of depth and reflection is what Kundera refers to as music without thought. The president of Forgetting gives a speech one day saying, "Children, you are the future." Kundera reflects in painful irony that he did not really mean that children will become adults and carry the future, but that humanity is becoming more and more a child. He shouted, "Children, never look back." And this meant that we must never allow the future to be weighed down by memory, for children have no past, and that is the whole secret of the magical innocence of their smiles. While Kundera remains ironic, he was diagnosing a condition of cultural regression, when people are content with conformity and being told how to behave and what to say, when narratives could be rewritten to suit the image one wants to project, when novelty and self-expression are prized above depth and reflection. That's perhaps the world he warned us about. I realized that this book is rich ground for political psychology, which I did not go into extensively in this detail, but maybe I revisit it in another video in the future. Until then, if you are still hungry for more diagnoses of the human condition, you might enjoy this video about Kierkegaard's diagnosis of the self.